ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So, adenosine triphosphate is the full form of ATP, and it is the primary energy currency of the cell. So, we all know that ATP is commonly known as the energy currency of the cell. So, when ATP is broken down, some amount of energy is released, and this can be used to power most of the biological processes. So ATP is the energy currency available for the cells in the human body, and when ATP is broken down, energy is released. Energy is released, and this energy is used to carry out most of the important biological processes in the cells of the human body. Now, some of the important biological processes that require the presence of ATP include DNA replication or copying of DNA. So, as we all know, before the cells divide or before the cells undergo mitosis to form two new cells, the DNA has to be copied and a complement of DNA has to be synthesized. So, before the cells or individual cell undergoes mitosis, DNA replication takes place wherein a new copy of DNA is synthesized, and DNA replication requires a lot of energy. Second one, so protein synthesis also requires a lot of energy from ATP. Synthesis of new proteins take place at ribosomes, and a lot of energy goes into producing new protein molecules. Next, it is also useful in powering active transport across the cell membrane. So, active transport refers to the movement of molecules from a region of their low concentration to high concentration, that is against their concentration gradient. We all know that passive transport like diffusion and osmosis will help to move molecules from a high to low concentration, but active transport is the opposite, and to move molecules from a region of their low concentration to high concentration, energy has to be spent, and this has to come from ATP. Another example is in the transmission of nerve impulses. So, the information is conveyed across neurons through a nerve impulse or an electrical impulse that passes along the body of a neuron, and this also requires ATP. Another example could be in contraction of muscles or muscle contraction. The movement of muscles in the human body also requires energy from ATP. So, these are some of the common examples that utilize the energy from ATP. In living organisms, ATP can be produced through three important processes. So, there are three major biological processes that help to produce ATP, starting with cellular respiration. So, cellular respiration refers to a series of metabolic reactions in which glucose is broken down to release the energy that can be stored in ATP. Now, cellular respiration can be aerobic or anaerobic. So, aerobic cellular respiration requires the presence of molecular oxygen, whereas anaerobic cellular respiration uses sulfur or sulfate as the terminal electron acceptor. Both the forms of cellular respiration help to generate ATP. Second one, fermentation. So, fermentation is distinct or pretty different from cellular respiration in that it only employs glycolysis and not the other steps in cellular respiration. So, fermentation will also help to produce some amount of ATP. It's important to remember that the amount of ATP produced in fermentation is much less than what is produced through cellular respiration, but fermentation also helps to produce some molecules of ATP. The other important one is called photophosphorylation. Photophosphorylation, and this is usually observed in plants. So the thylakoid membranes of the chloroplast produce ATP through a process called photophosphorylation. So these are three important biological processes that all help to produce ATP. Now, ATP can actually be considered like a rechargeable battery. ATP is nothing but a rechargeable battery because the bonds that are present in ATP can be easily broken down. They can be broken down and they can also be reformed. So, these are two important things. So, whenever required, ATP can be broken down, and when energy is available, ATP can also be reproduced or resynthesized. Now, let us look at the structure of ATP or adenosine triphosphate. So, ATP has three basic components. First, let us look at adenosine. So, adenosine is a combination of the 5 carbon sugar, which is ribose, and the nitrogenous base, which is adenine. These two together constitute adenosine. So, ribose is a 5 carbon sugar, it's a monosaccharide. Now, ribose is also a component of the nucleic acid RNA. So, ribonucleic acid also contains the same 5 carbon sugar, which is ribose. Now, adenine is the nitrogenous base. Adenine is also found in DNA and RNA. Okay. So, adenosine is an organic compound that is made up of a 5 carbon sugar and adenine. Now, to this group, phosphate molecules are attached, phosphate groups are attached, and this combination gives as ATP. So, ATP is basically a combination of adenosine plus 3 phosphate groups. This is adenosine triphosphate. So, let's see the structure of ATP and see where the energy is actually stored. I'm drawing the 5 carbon ribose sugar first. So, this is the 5 carbon ribose sugar, to which is the attached nitrogenous base. Okay. Now, this is ribose sugar. It is made up of 5 carbons, to which is attached the purine, which is adenine. Okay. So, I'm just going to draw the basic structure. So, adenine, which is a purine, is made up of two rings. It has a 5 carbon plus a 6 carbon ring. So, like we discussed, this combination of ribose sugar and adenine nitrogenous base is together called adenosine. adenosine. Now to the ribose sugar, we have the phosphate groups attached. Phosphorus, double bond oxygen, OH, oxygen. Again, we have the second phosphate group. Third one, double bond O, OH, OH. So this is the basic structure of ATP. First, we derive the adenosine, and to the ribose sugar, we have three phosphate groups attached. Okay. So adenosine plus one phosphate group, which is this one, would give as AMP, or adenosine monophosphate. Monophosphate. So mono refers to the single phosphate group. Okay. Similarly, if another phosphate group gets attached, then we get ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate. So adenosine plus two phosphate groups is called ADP. And finally, we have ATP, which is what we are discussing in this video. So ATP will have three phosphate groups, 1, 2, and 3 attached to the adenosine moiety. Okay. Now these bonds that are here hold energy. These are the bonds in ATP molecule that hold energy, and when broken down, they will release a lot of energy. Okay. So these are known as phosphoanhydride bonds. So in the first step, the first phosphate group can be broken down to generate ADP, and if required, one more phosphate can also be liberated to finally generate adenosine monophosphate. So there are two high energy bonds in the structure of ATP molecule that can be broken down to release energy that can power most of the biological processes. Now let's look at the hydrolysis or breakdown of ATP reaction. Breakdown of ATP. Now the breakdown of ATP requires a molecule of water. So ATP in the presence of a water molecule gets broken down to form adenosine diphosphate plus an inorganic phosphate plus energy. So when the terminal phosphate group gets broken down, a lot of energy is made available to the cells. Okay. So the product formed is adenosine diphosphate. Now this is essentially a hydrolysis reaction. Hydrolysis reaction, as it requires a molecule of water. Okay. And this is the exergonic reaction, because this reaction releases a lot of energy. And it's important to note that if some more energy is required, the ADP can also be broken down to release AMP plus inorganic phosphate. So in this process also energy is released. Now let's look at the other reaction, which is the endergonic reaction. So the first one is the breakdown of ATP to release energy. Second one is the production of ATP, production of ATP. Now, as we discussed initially, in cellular respiration, the 6 carbon compound glucose is broken down to release energy. So, glucose is broken down in a series of metabolic steps to release the energy that gets stored in the form of ATP. That gets stored in the form of ATP. Now, for ATP to form, this is the reaction. So, ADP plus an inorganic phosphate. Now, because this is an endergonic reaction, it requires energy. And this energy is essentially coming from the breakdown of glucose. Okay. So, ADP plus inorganic phosphate plus energy, that is essentially coming from the breakdown of glucose, helps to regenerate ATP, releasing a molecule of water in the process. Okay. Now, this is the endergonic reaction. Now, this is also a dehydration reaction, a dehydration reaction, because this process releases water, or it removes a water molecule. Now, these are the two important reactions that show us how ATP is produced or how ATP is broken down to release the energy. Okay. So remember that breakdown of ATP is an exergonic reaction because energy is released into the cells, while the production of ATP requires energy and it is a endergonic reaction. Now let's look at the ATP-ADP cycle. ATP-ADP cycle. So we have ATP and we have ADP. So in the first phase, ATP can be broken down to produce ADP and inorganic phosphate, and in the process also releasing energy. And this is a hydrolysis reaction, meaning it requires water. Okay. So this is the first phase of the ATP-ADP cycle. And when energy is available, ADP is again regenerated back into ATP. Okay. So this is the next phase. When energy is available, energy, and remember that this energy has to come from the breakdown of glucose through aerobic or anaerobic cellular respiration. Okay. So glucose is broken down in a series of steps to release its stored energy, which can then be used to regenerate ATP. Now, this reaction takes in a molecule of inorganic phosphate and it releases a molecule of water. So, this is the ATP ADP cycle. Now, all the cells in the human body need to produce their own ATP. So, all the cells that are there in literally all the tissues of the human body have to produce their own ATP, and it cannot be transported from one cell to the other. So, ATP cannot be transported, and whatever the cells are producing, it will be for their own purpose. Okay. Now, we know that glucose contains some chemical energy, and ATP also contains chemical energy. So these are the two important molecules that we know that can be broken down to release chemical energy. Okay. Now, although both of them contain energy, it's important to note that ATP contains much less energy than is available in glucose. Okay. This is a short overview of the ATP ADP cycle that operates in the cells of the human body. If you found this video helpful, please do share it with your friends.